Hey everybody, got a question. How efficient is your brewing process? Let's talk about it after the title. Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for finding my channel. Appreciate you being here. Today I want to talk about efficiency. And yes, for the first time I have some notes in front of me because there's an awful lot I want to cover and I just don't want to miss anything. So the first question is, what is efficiency? Because you're not going to come across efficiency when you're talking about brewing wine or mead or cider. It's really something that's very specific to beer. And the reason is because beer is made with grain. And you're getting your sugar from the grain. Whereas wine and other things, usually you're getting your sugar from fruit and added, sugar that you're adding in. So efficiency is the potential sugar that you can convert from the grain in your wort. So let's talk first about different definitions here of efficiency. There's mash efficiency and there's brew house efficiency. And I want to mention that because you're going to see both when you're looking at recipes or online calculators and that sort of thing. So mash efficiency is exactly what it sounds like. It is specifically how much sugar you convert of your grain itself, of the mash itself. Whereas brew house efficiency is the whole shebang, right? That's how your equipment affects it, your grain that you've milled, any adjuncts and things you add to your wort, the grain, efficiency itself. So it's everything put together that affects your efficiency. So why is efficiency important? So the real main reason, in my opinion, is because you're trying to hit a specific gravity number. Your recipe is going to say, hey, at the end of your entire brew day and making this wort, you should have this specific gravity number, and it should be close to what we have in our recipe, which means that you've matched pretty much what we did when we made it. And that makes sure that you're on the right track. You have about the same alcohol volume that the recipe is going to say you're going to have, all that stuff. Same flavor too. Flavor and body, I guess I should say, will be consistent. So these numbers so what affects your efficiency? Like what kinds of things can make it better or worse or affect that number? So first of all, there's the grain itself. So grain itself has what's called like a potential efficiency. So say your 2-row, your base grain. It comes from the maltster with a potential gravity or potential efficiency, meaning it's only going to be able to convert a certain amount into sugar, and it's not going to be 100%. Your specialty grains, maybe caramel malt, that might have a different, potential efficiency. The deal is you have no control over this. This is all, what the grain itself can do. So this is not something to stress over because there's nothing you can do to change that except for completely changing your grain and using a different kind of grain that maybe has a higher potential efficiency. That's the first thing. Secondly, how you mill the grain makes a big difference. So if you go to a homebrew store, you're kind of stuck because you have to mill your grain in their mill at the store, and they have it preset I talk about this in my grain video, which I'll link up here. But they set it to a specific, size for milling that's kind of hopefully universal for everybody, and they don't let you change it, because imagine if everybody was fiddling with, the grain size, it would be a nightmare to have to manage that. So you're stuck with whatever they set it to, which means your efficiency is stuck to whatever they've got it set to. So at some point, if you're doing a lot of brewing, you may end up buying a home mill. And again, you can see that, geez, I can't point right, in my brewing or my grain video, which again, I'll link up here. So they're not super inexpensive, but they're not outrageously expensive. So if you do a lot of brewing, it will eventually pay for itself, because when you buy grain, if you buy it unmilled, it's cheaper than having it milled. When you go to the homebrew store, you have to pay a premium to use their mill. So you can adjust the mill at home however you want it. You can make a finer maybe mill on it, finer grind, and get a better efficiency. There is a fine line though on how fine you want to mill your grain. Remember, grain is basically what turns into flour. So if you mill it too finely, you get almost a powdery flour. And what happens when you add water to flour? It turns into dough. So the problem is, if it gets doughy, your water is not really able to pass through the grains and interact with the grain, and so you're not going to extract as much sugar, because it's just going to be like rinsing the outside of that dough, but not getting in and flowing through it. So you want it to be a certain amount of coarseness so that water can flow through it. There are other things like the method of mashing. For example, a lot of us these days use a brew in the bag. Not everybody, but a lot of us do. A brew in the bag is nice because you can do a slightly finer grind than you would normally do, because you're not going to have what's called a stuck sparge. I don't want to go into what that is in this video, but because you can lift the whole bag up if you need to a little bit and give it a jiggle, and you can, it just makes it so that you can do a little finer milling and get a little bit better efficiency. But remember what I said, there's a fine line between having it a little bit, finer of a milling and going overboard and turning it practically into flour. Sparge temperature. So this is something I think a lot of people might overlook. It's important. When you sparge, rinsing your grain, you actually are using a certain temperature of water, because it will basically halt the conversion, or the enzymes from converting the grain to sugar, so that as you're rinsing it, it's turning off that action. So most people say like 170 degrees, which is around 76.5 Celsius. You can go a couple degrees lower, but that's about where you want to be when you rinse your grain. You don't want to be any hotter, you don't want to be much cooler. That's your happy zone. So that matters. The other part of sparging that matters, that affects your efficiency, is speed. I have seen videos where people just take, water and have a jug and just, literally just pour it. That's definitely not the best method for sparging. The best method for sparging would be to do what's called fly sparging. Most of us are not going to have that set up. I do not have that set up. A fly sparge is basically like a shower arm. It hangs over the top of your kettle, and it sprinkles just like a shower, very slowly sprinkles water right through your mash. And generally speaking, a normal sparge would take like 45 minutes. That's how slowly the water is being trickled through your wort. Mine doesn't take that long for two reasons. Number one is I don't have a fly sparge, and number two, I don't sparge with as much water as most people. I think I use 2 gallons. That's usually my standard for a 5.5 gallon batch. So I use less water, and I do sort of a modified fly sparge. What I do, and you can see it in my full brew video that I will link up there. What I do is I put a colander on top of my tank, and then I slowly ladle in water that's 170 degrees, 76.5 Celsius, and it will dribble down through the colander, and that helps slow it down and dribble it. I would say it takes me 15 to 20 minutes to sparge. I'm not going to spend 45 minutes. Also, because of my setup, I'll talk about this, but I have a continuous sparge using a pump, so I don't usually have an issue with sparging like this. But just keep that in mind, that the temperature and the speed you sparge at affect your efficiency big time. What else? Planning your dead space. So you have space at the bottom. Maybe you have a false bottom on the bottom of your kettle. You have the tubing if you have a pump. You have wort that gets into those spaces that you're not going to use because it's called like dead space. Which is why we've specifically planned for 5.5 gallons when we make a beer recipe, not 5, because we expect to lose about a half gallon. Just in, trube and stuff that might be a little bit in the tubing or the pump. So plan for that, but remember that if you don't plan for it and you lose that half gallon, it will affect your overall numbers and your efficiency. All right, as you can see, we're on page 2. So the last thing I want to talk about as far as your efficiency and what can adjust it, mess with it, is dough balls. Everybody knows, I think, about dough balls. It's basically these sections of your dough, well, not dough, but your mash that didn't get mixed. And so you could have a section in your mash that's dry for the entire hour because you didn't properly really mix it up. And if it's dry, that means it didn't convert any sugar because it didn't get any water interacting with it. So yeah, you got to make sure maybe... most people will say pour the grain in slowly and mix it as you go, and then after you've mixed, poured it all in, do a really good mixing. I'll be honest with you, I still stir my mash probably once every 15 minutes at least throughout the entire mash process. Also, I use a pump. I kind of alluded to this before. So my system has a pump that takes the water from the bottom of the pot, circulates it back up, and sprinkles it across the top of the grain. There's a couple of reasons to do that. Number one is it keeps the overall temperature more even throughout the entire mash so that I can maintain a specific temperature. Also, it's basically like a continuous sparge because you're continually moving the water through your grain. It's not the right temperature for a sparge, and it's not clean water to really rinse it, but it's sort of like a continuous sparge throughout the whole mashing. And I have heard of people who do this and just flat out remove the entire sparging process from making beer because they claim their efficiency is so good by using a pump to circulate that they don't need to sparge. And that might be the case. I've never really taken the time to take all these measurements and see whether or not I should just remove that step. And part of it's nostalgia. I feel like that's a part of making beer, and I kind of want to do that step because I feel like that's a part of the whole process and experience. But at any rate, let me give you some quick tips here before I end on how to hit your gravity number. Remember, I was saying every recipe has this gravity number that you want to hit, your OG, your original gravity number. That's how you know if you got everything right. So the first trick is you can compensate for having a bad efficiency. So if you know right off the bat, right out of the gates, that you tend to have a bad efficiency, meaning when you make beer in the past, you never seem to hit your gravity number. You're always too low, right? You never can seem to extract enough sugar to hit the number you want. In that case, you can compensate. If you know that's the case, add more grain up front. So you take a recipe you find online, and if you know that you're going to be having problems hitting those numbers, add half a grain. That wouldn't do much. Add half a pound of like 2-row to it, and then see how that works out for you. If you need to add more, change it to a pound next time. Get to a point where you know, hey, I need to add a pound or a half a pound of 2-row in order to make sure I hit my numbers and get that final gravity number. So that's one method that you can do, and there's nothing wrong with it. The second one is use rice hulls. I don't seem to have a problem when I do mine, but if say you milled your grain and it's too fine, it's like a powder, or it's throw in a handful of rice hulls. They're pretty inexpensive to buy, and it's basically like adding extra grain hulls that would have been there if you hadn't milled it quite so fine. And it gives your grain a little bit of space in between all the different kernels of grain, so that water can flow through it more evenly. And so the more water that can interact with more kernels of grain, the more you're going to convert to sugar and up your efficiency. As a last resort, I don't really recommend this, but I have tried it. It does work. But you can add LME or DME at the end of your boil. So that's liquid malt extract or dry malt extract. This is the thing that you would use if you're doing an extract brew instead of a all grain brew. So you can buy, like I keep a bag of dry malt extract around. If you were low, you hadn't hit your gravity number, you were too low, you could add, and you can use online calculators usually to kind of calculate how much you need to add, but you could add whatever amount of malt extract that you need to, and that will up your gravity to the correct number. The downside is it's a base malt, so you're not adding anything too exceptional to it as far as adding flavors and stuff, but I will say this: I would highly recommend using that over just adding sugar. I've done that too in the early days, because I came from wine and beer and mead. I'm sorry, wine and mead and ciders, where you do add sugar. The problem is if you add sugar to beer, it doesn't do much. You don't get any body. In fact, it thins the beer out, because there's nothing, the yeast just eats all the sugar. So yes, you'll hit your gravity number, but you'll have a very thin beer with not much body, and it doesn't add any mouthfeel or complexity or anything. So I would stay away from just adding sugar to hit your numbers. Instead, use malt extract. It'll be a much better experience, much better beer in the end. And lastly, my trick, and what I do every time I brew, and again, you can see this in my all-day home brewing video that I'll put up here, use less water in your mash. I have found, and I've done a lot of research on this, that you can get better efficiency if you use less water in your mash. So essentially what you're doing is you're making a concentrated wort, which will have way more sugar in it than you actually need. So for example, and don't necessarily use these numbers because it may not be the same translated to whatever system you use, but for 5.5 gallon batch, what did I say that was for 5.5 gallons? 20.8 liters. I start with 3 to 3.5 gallons of water for my mash. That's 11.3 to 13.2 liters of water is what I use for my mash. And that's it. And it's not very much. And you may have to adjust that if you have more grain. I would say that I never have more than 16 pounds of grain because my system really isn't built for more than that. So I would say I'm usually around 12 pounds of grain, give or take. So after I've mashed, I usually have to add a couple gallons, which is like 7.5 liters of sparge water. And after that, at the very end, after I finish the boil, I'm going to have less than I want. If I'm trying to make a 5.5 gallon batch, I'm going to end up with, let's say, maybe 4 gallons. And then what you can do is use an online calculator and type in how many gallons you have or how many liters you have. And then you can also type in the current gravity number that you have. And it will say, hey, if you're trying to reach 5.5 gallons, or if you're trying to reach this ending gravity number, here's how much more water you need to add or dilute to get to that gravity number. If your efficiency is really good and spot on, you'll be able to get to that 5.5 gallons. If your efficiency is not so good or a little less, you may end up with a little less, than 5.5. You may end up with 5 gallons or, just under 5 gallons. But you'll hit your gravity number, and next time, like I was saying earlier, add a little extra grain if you're having trouble reaching that final destination of the right gravity number or the right volume at the end of your beer. Yeah. So, the last thing I want to say is, and of course, if you've read any homebrew books, you've heard this saying, relax, have a homebrew. If your gravity number is off a little bit, guess what? Mine is almost never going to be identical to the recipe. It's almost impossible to get the exact same because they're using different equipment, different water profile, maybe even different grain. So don't stress. As long as it's relatively close, then you've done your job. But if it is off or your ABV is a little higher, it doesn't matter. In fact, you may have just ended up making a different kind of beer, a different tasting beer, but it's still beer and it's still probably going to taste good. So don't worry about it. All right, that's all I have to say about that. Thanks again for being here. Thanks for staying till the end of the video. It means a lot to me. It would help me a lot if you would come down here and hit the like button. If you want to get notified the next time I put out a video, hit the subscribe button, which should also be a link down here. Hit the bell icon if you're on a phone, and you'll get notified. I usually put out a video every Monday morning. And have a great day. And hopefully you're brewing something good. So happy brewing.